The morning sun hadn't quite burned off the Atlanta haze when Alara Voss pulled her duffel bag from the trunk of her car and clicked the lock shut. She'd just landed from a red-eye out of Seattle, her eyelids heavy, her neck stiff from dozing in the jump seat. But she wasn't heading home, not yet. She had another flight in 3 hours, this time to Charlotte, and before that she needed coffee, a quiet corner, and maybe 5 minutes with her eyes closed in the crew lounge. Alara wasn't just any pilot. She was one of the few black women in the country flying wide-body jets for a major U.S. airline. Not that you'd know it from the way people looked at her. More than once, passengers had asked if she could bring them extra blankets, thinking she was part of the cabin crew. Gate agents had double-checked her ID, even when she was in full uniform, wings pinned proudly above her left breast pocket. She'd learned to carry her patients like a second flight bag, worn, reliable, and always within reach. She walked through the terminal with the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned every inch of her place in the sky. Her boots clicked against the polished floor, her navy blazer crisp despite the overnight flight. She nodded at familiar faces, a baggage handler, a coffee cart vendor, a fellow first officer she'd flown with last month. Most returned the gesture. Some didn't look up at all. The crew lounge sat behind a discreet door near gate B12, accessible only to verified airline personnel. A new security guard stood by the entrance, tall, broad-shouldered, earpiece coiled around his neck. Alara didn't recognize him. Probably knew. She swiped her company-issued badge. The reader beeped green, but the guard stepped in front of her. "Hold on," he said, voice flat. "This area's for crew only." Alara blinked. "I am crew." He crossed his arms. "You sure about that?" She didn't sigh, didn't roll her eyes. She'd been here before in different airports with different faces, same script. Instead, she unzipped her flight bag just enough to pull out her FAA airline transport pilot certificate, laminated and official, with her photo and signature. She also held up her company ID, her uniform clearly visible, her captain's stripes unmistakable on her shoulders. "I'm Captain Voss," she said evenly. "I'm scheduled to fly Horizon Sky 422 to Charlotte in a few hours. I'd like to use the lounge." The guard glanced at her documents, then back at her face as if trying to match the photo to the person standing in front of him. His expression didn't change. "Policy says I gotta verify appearance matches ID," he said, "and you don't really look like a pilot." The words landed like a slow leak in a tire. Quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. A few feet away, a flight attendant paused mid-stride, watching. Another pilot, a white man in his 50s, stood by the coffee machine inside the lounge, mug in hand, eyes darting between Alara and the guard. No one spoke up. Alara felt the heat rise in her chest, but her voice stayed calm. "What does a pilot look like to you?" The guard shifted his weight. "You know what I mean," she didn't argue. Didn't raise her voice. She knew how that would play out, how it always played out. Instead, she slipped her phone from her pocket and snapped a quick photo of the guard's name tag and the posted lounge access policy on the wall beside him. Then she tucked everything back into her bag, gave a small, tight nod, and walked away. But she didn't go far. She found a quiet bench near a charging station, sat down, and took a slow breath. Her hands trembled slightly, not from anger, but from the weight of it all. Not just this moment, but every moment like it. The interviews where she was asked if she'd copied someone else's answers on her written exam. The simulator sessions where instructors forgot to call her by name. The time a passenger refused to board because a woman that young shouldn't be flying a jet. Never mind that she'd been flying since she was 16. Alara hadn't grown up dreaming of skyscrapers or boardrooms. She'd grown up in a dusty Georgia town where the nearest airport was a patch of cracked concrete with a single windsock. Her grandfather, a retired crop duster mechanic, had taught her how to read an altimeter before she could ride a bike. She'd spent summers under the wings of old Cessnas handing him wrenches, wiping oil off her hands with rags that smelled like summer rain and gasoline. She'd worked 3 jobs through community college, saved every penny, and scraped together enough for flight school. When scholarships came, they came late and never enough. She'd flown solo in a beat-up Piper Cherokee with a radio that crackled like bacon, her heart pounding not from fear, but from the sheer joy of being alone in the sky, where no one cared what she looked like, only how she flew. Now, years later, With thousands of hours logged and a captain's chair earned through skill and sweat, she was still being told she didn't belong. She stared at her phone screen, at the photo she'd just taken. It wasn't just about a cup of coffee or a place to rest. It was about respect. About being seen for what she was. A professional, trained, certified, and responsible for hundreds of lives every time she strapped into the cockpit. She thought about letting it go. Again, swallowing it like she always did. Because rocking the boat could mean being labeled difficult, or worse, being passed over for upgrades, international routes, leadership roles. The aviation world was small and reputations stuck like static cling, but something felt different this time. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the silence of her colleagues in that hallway. Or maybe it was the memory of her grandfather's voice, gravelly and firm. If you see something wrong, you fix it. Even if it's not your job. She opened her notes app and started typing. Not just about the guard, but about everything. The pattern. The emails she'd sent to HR that went unanswered. The time she'd been assigned to a smaller aircraft than her white male counterpart, with less seniority. The crew lounge access logs she'd quietly saved after noticing discrepancies. She'd never planned to use them. She just kept them, like receipts for a debt the industry didn't know it owed. By the time she stood up, her resolve had settled like ballast in her chest. She wouldn't file a complaint through the usual channels. Those led to polite acknowledgments and empty promises. This time she'd go straight to the source, the Federal Aviation Administration. Not just as a pilot, but as a witness to a system that still treated some crew members as guests in their own workplace. She walked back toward the terminal, not toward the exit, but toward the rental car counter. She wasn't going home. Not yet. As she drove out of the airport, Atlanta's skyline shimmered in the rearview mirror. Planes lifted off in steady rhythm, vanishing into the blue. Each one carried people who assumed their pilots were exactly who they appeared to be. Competent, qualified, unquestioned. Alara knew better. She knew that for some, the hardest part of flying wasn't the weather or the weight calculations. It was walking through a door that should have opened without question and being told, once again, that you don't look like you belong. But today, she decided, would be different. She pulled into the parking lot of a nondescript office building 20 minutes from the airport, the regional headquarters of the FAA. Her hands were steady now, her mind clear. She walked in, badge in hand, and asked to speak with someone in the Office of Civil Rights. The receptionist eyed her uniform, then her face, then her wings. For once, there was no hesitation. Right this way, Captain. And as she followed the hallway toward a door marked Compliance and Equity, Alara didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like someone finally coming home, to a place where truth, not appearance, held the controls. The FAA office smelled like old paper and strong coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Alara sat in a folding chair outside a closed door labeled Compliance Review, by appointment only. She'd been waiting 20 minutes. Her flight bag rested at her feet, still zipped tight around her logbooks, her certificates, and the notes she'd typed in the airport hallway just hours before. She didn't fidget. She'd learned long ago that stillness could be louder than shouting. Finally, the door opened. A young man in a slightly wrinkled button-down stepped out, nodded at her, and gestured inside. "They'll see you now." The room was small, lined with filing cabinets and a whiteboard covered in acronyms she recognized from safety briefings. Behind a cluttered desk sat a woman in her early 30s, glasses perched low on her nose, hair pulled back in a messy bun. Her name tag read, Lena Cho, Aviation Civil Rights Liaison. "Captain Voss?" Lena asked, standing quickly. "Thanks for coming in. Please sit." Alara took the chair across from her, placing her bag on her lap like a shield. She didn't launch into her story right away. Instead, she watched Lena's eyes, saw how they flickered with curiosity, not skepticism when they landed on her wings. "I was denied access to my airline's crew lounge this morning," Alara began, voice low but steady, not because I lacked credentials, but because the security guard said I didn't look like a pilot. Lena's pen hovered over her notepad. "Did you file a report with your airline?" "I've filed 3 over the past 2 years, Alara said. All got the same response. We take diversity seriously and we'll look into it." Nothing changed. She reached into her bag and pulled out a slim folder. Inside were printed emails, screenshots of internal crew scheduling logs, and a timeline she'd built showing how minority pilots, especially women of color, were consistently assigned to shorter, less desirable routes, passed over for international upgrades, and more frequently questioned at crew checkpoints. She'd even included a copy of the lounge access policy, highlighted where it said verification should be based on uniform and ID, not subjective judgment. Lena flipped through the pages slowly. Her expression shifted from professional interest to something sharper. Concern. "This is unusually thorough," she said. "I didn't plan to bring it," Alara admitted. "But I got tired of being told it was just one incident. It's never just one." Lena leaned back, tapping her pen against the desk. "You understand that the FAA doesn't usually step in on personnel disputes unless there's a safety or regulatory violation involved." "I'm not here just as an employee," Alara said. "I'm here as a certificated airman." And when crew members are treated as outsiders in their own workplace, when access to rest areas, briefing zones, and secure facilities is denied based on appearance, it creates fatigue, distraction, and erodes trust in operational protocols. "That's a safety issue," Lena paused. Then she nodded slowly. "You're right." She stood, walked to a locked cabinet, and pulled out a thick binder labeled Horizon Sky Pending Reviews. Alara's stomach tightened. She hadn't expected her airline to already be under scrutiny. "We've had whispers," Lena said quietly. "Anonymous tips about inconsistent training records, skipped simulator sessions, lax oversight on crew rest compliance. Nothing concrete until now." She looked at Alara. "If what you're showing me is accurate, this isn't just about bias. It's about systemic failure. And if crew verification is being handled arbitrarily, that opens the door to real security risks." Alara hadn't thought of it that way. She'd come to report unfair treatment, not uncover a safety loophole. But the moment Lena said it, it clicked. If a guard can deny a captain entry because she doesn't look right, what's stopping someone else from slipping through because they look the part? They talked for another hour. Lena asked careful, precise questions, not to challenge Alara, but to build a case. When Alara mentioned her mentor, retired FAA Inspector Darnell Croft, Lena's eyes lit up. "Croft? He's legendary. He pushed for the first fatigue risk management guidelines back in '09. He taught me that safety isn't just about the plane," Alara said. "It's about the people in it and how they're treated on the ground." By the time she left the office, the sun was high, and her flight to Charlotte had long been reassigned to another captain. She didn't care. For the first time in years, she felt like someone had truly listened, not as a diversity checkbox, but as a professional with eyes wide open. That evening, she sat on her porch with a glass of iced tea, watching fireflies blink in the Georgia dusk. Her phone buzzed. A message from Lena. "Your file's been escalated to both Civil Rights and Aviation Safety Divisions. They're initiating a joint review." "Thank you," Alara exhaled. She hadn't expected action this fast. Over the next 2 days, things moved quietly but quickly. FAA investigators began pulling Horizon Sky's crew training logs, lounge access records, and internal HR complaints. They interviewed flight attendants, ground staff, and pilots, many of whom, once assured of confidentiality, shared stories eerily similar to Alara's. One first officer described being asked to prove he was crew by reciting aircraft call signs. Another recalled being told the lounge coffee machine was for captains only, but only when she was on duty. Meanwhile, Alara tried to return to normal. She flew a short hop to Nashville, then a red-eye to Denver, but the cockpit felt different now. Not because anything had changed in the air, up there the sky was still fair, but because she no longer felt alone on the ground. Then, on the third morning, her phone rang at 5 a.m. It was Lena again. Her voice was tight, urgent. "Alara, we found something big." She explained that during a routine audit of Horizon Sky's pilot recertification records, investigators discovered that nearly 30% of active captains hadn't completed their mandatory annual simulator training. Not just delayed, missing entirely. Some hadn't logged a session in over 18 months. Worse, the airline's internal tracking system had been manually overridden to show compliance status. "That's illegal," Alara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's worse than illegal," Lena replied. "It's reckless. And if the FAA can't verify that pilots are current and qualified, we can't certify the airline as safe to operate." Ilara's mind raced. She thought of the passengers who'd boarded Horizon Sky flights, trusting that everyone in the cockpit had met the same rigorous standards she had. She thought of the young first officers trying to learn from captains who might not even be legally allowed to fly. "What happens now?" she asked. "There's an emergency review meeting this afternoon," Lena said. "If they confirm the findings, and early signs say they will, the FAA may suspend Horizon Sky's operating certificate." Ilara went silent. Suspending an airline's license wasn't just rare, it was nuclear. It meant grounding every single flight, stranding thousands of passengers, costing millions by the hour. It only happened when public safety was at immediate risk, and it was happening because a security guard wouldn't let a black woman into a lounge. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt heavy. This wasn't revenge. It was consequence. That afternoon, she drove back to the FAA office, not to speak but to wait. She sat in her car in the parking lot, listening to aviation radio chatter on her handheld receiver. Then at 3:17 p.m., a press release pinged on her phone. "The Federal Aviation Administration has issued an emergency order, temporarily suspending the operating certificate of Horizon Sky Airlines due to documented failures in pilot training compliance and crew verification protocols. All Horizon Sky flights are grounded effective immediately." Her hands shook as she read it, not from fear but from the sheer weight of what it meant. An entire airline, frozen, because the system had finally caught up with its own rot. News vans began arriving within the hour. Reporters shouted questions at FAA officials on the steps of the building. Social media exploded. Grounded for Good trended. Former Horizon Sky employees posted stories of being ignored when they raised concerns. Aviation forums lit up with debate, some calling it an overreach, others saying it was long overdue. Ilara stayed out of it. She turned off her notifications, went home, and made herself a simple dinner. But as she ate, she kept thinking about the guard from the lounge. Had he known? Did he care? Or was he just another cog in a machine that only saw some people as real? Later that night, she received a call from an old friend, a pilot who'd left Horizon Sky 2 years ago after being denied a promotion despite perfect evaluations. "I saw the news," he said, voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe it actually happened. They finally listened." "They didn't listen to me," Ilara said softly. "They listened to the evidence." There was a pause. Then he said, "Same thing in the end." She hung up and walked outside. The night sky was clear, stars scattered like scattered rivets across black metal. Somewhere above, other airlines were still flying, carrying people home to vacations, to new beginnings, safe, because someone had cared enough to check the details. Ilara looked up and smiled just a little. She hadn't set out to ground an airline. She just wanted to sit in a quiet room with a cup of coffee before her next flight. But sometimes, she realized, the smallest act of dignity could ripple outward in ways no one expected, and maybe, just maybe, that ripple could finally clear the runway for others who looked like her to land without question. The news hit like a thunderclap on a clear day. One moment, Horizon Sky Airlines was just another name on departure boards across the country. The next, every one of its planes sat motionless on tarmacs from Boston to San Diego. Cabin lights dark, jet bridges retracted, flight crews sent home with no idea when, or if, they'd fly again. Passengers crowded airport gates, confused and frustrated, clutching boarding passes that now meant nothing. Social media flooded with videos of stranded travelers, angry rants, and bewildered families trying to reroute last-minute vacations. But beneath the chaos, something quieter was happening. People were finally paying attention. Ilara watched it unfold from her living room, phone in hand, blinds half closed against the afternoon sun. She hadn't given any interviews, hadn't posted anything online. But her name was already circulating in aviation circles, whispered in crew lounges and pilot group chats. That captain from Atlanta? The one who got them grounded. Some called her a hero. Others, behind closed doors, muttered that she'd gone too far. She ignored it all. What mattered wasn't what people said about her. It was whether anything would actually change. By the next morning, the story had legs. Major news outlets ran segments not just on the license suspension, but on the deeper issue, how an airline could let training records go unverified for so long. Experts pointed out that simulator sessions weren't just paperwork, they were lifelines. In those high-fidelity mock-ups, Pilots practiced engine failures over water, wind shear on final approach, cabin depressurization at 35,000 feet. Skipping them wasn't cutting corners. It was gambling with lives. Then came the internal documents, leaked, no one knew by whom, showing that Horizon Sky's management had known about the training gaps for months. Emails revealed pressure from executives to keep planes flying during peak travel season, even as compliance officers flagged missing certifications. One memo bluntly stated, "Delay audit findings until Q4 revenue targets are met." The public outrage grew, but so did the support. Former Horizon Sky employees began speaking out, not just about training, but about a culture where speaking up meant being sidelined. A black flight attendant described being told her tone was too aggressive when she reported a safety concern. A South Asian first officer recalled being passed over for upgrade training, while less experienced white colleagues moved ahead. And then there were the lounge stories. Dozens of them, pilots of color turned away, asked for extra ID, made to wait while others walked right in. Alara read every account. Each one felt like a mirror. Meanwhile, the airline scrambled. Their CEO, a polished man who'd never flown a single hour himself, held a press conference. He apologized for any perception of impropriety, praised the airline's commitment to inclusion, and promised a full internal review. But he never admitted fault, never named the systemic failures. And he certainly didn't mention Alara. She wasn't surprised. In her experience, institutions rarely thanked the person who held up the mirror. They just blamed them for the cracks it revealed. 2 days after the grounding, she got a call from Lena at the FAA. "They're not just looking at training logs anymore," Lena said. "We're auditing their entire crew operations manual. And guess what we found?" Alara waited. Their professional appearance guidelines for pilots still reference outdated grooming standards that disproportionately affect natural black hairstyles. Their crew verification protocol, vague enough to let bias slip through like wind through a cracked window. And their diversity training, last updated in 2014. It's basically a PDF titled, "Be Nice to Everyone." Alara closed her eyes. It wasn't malice, not always. Sometimes it was just laziness. The kind that said, "We've always done it this way," until someone got hurt, or until someone like her refused to stay quiet. That same week, she received an unexpected visitor. A young woman in her early 20s stood on her porch wearing a Horizon Sky polo shirt and holding a manila envelope. She introduced herself as Taylor, a junior flight attendant who'd been grounded along with everyone else. "I didn't come to ask for your help," Taylor said quickly, as if bracing for rejection. "I came to thank you." Alara invited her in. Over iced tea, Taylor explained that she'd been reporting inconsistent crew access policies for over a year, how black and brown crew members were routinely asked for extra ID, while others walked through unchallenged. HR had filed her complaints under interpersonal conflict. No follow-up. No change, but now, Taylor's eyes shone. Now they're listening. The union's demanding a full overhaul. People are talking. Really talking. Alara saw herself in Taylor. The same fire, the same fear of being labeled difficult. She handed her a copy of her own early flight logs. "Keep speaking," she said. "Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." As Taylor left, Alara felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who'd been told to wait their turn, lower their voice, or be grateful for the seat they'd already earned. Back at Horizon Sky headquarters, the fallout deepened. The airline's stock plummeted by 40%. Major corporate clients suspended contracts. The Department of Transportation launched its own civil rights investigation. And then the blow that shook the industry. The FAA announced it would not reinstate Horizon Sky's operating certificate until the airline met 3 non-negotiable conditions: verified training compliance for every pilot, revised crew verification protocols with zero tolerance for discriminatory enforcement, and the appointment of an independent equity auditor approved by the FAA. It was unprecedented, but the real turning point came when the security guard who denied Alara entry was fired, not just for bias, but for violating federal aviation security procedures. The FAA made it clear, crew verification wasn't a matter of opinion. It was a regulated safety function, and treating it as anything else endangered everyone on board. Alara read the termination notice with mixed feelings. She didn't want him punished out of spite, but she was glad the system finally recognized that his actions weren't just rude, they were dangerous. Then, late one night, her phone buzzed with a message from someone she hadn't heard from in years. Darnell Croft, her old mentor. He'd seen the news. "You didn't just clip their wings," he wrote. "You grounded the whole damn nest until they fixed the cracks. Proud of you, kid." She smiled, tears welling up. That was the closest Darnell ever came to saying, "I told you so." In the days that followed, Ilara stayed off social media, turned down interview requests, and avoided the spotlight. But she couldn't avoid the impact. At the grocery store, a woman recognized her uniform and quietly said, "My daughter wants to be a pilot. Thank you for making that feel possible." At a gas station, a retired Air Force mechanic gave her a nod and said, "About time someone held their feet to the fire." She wasn't a symbol. She didn't want to be. She was just a pilot who'd asked to be treated like one. Yet the ripples kept spreading. Other airlines began quietly reviewing their own policies. The National Business Aviation Association issued new guidance on inclusive crew verification. Even the simulator training companies reported a surge in inquiries from carriers suddenly eager to prove they were compliant. And through it all, Horizon Sky remained grounded, silent, humbled, and under watch. Ilara knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Rebuilding trust took longer than losing it. Policies could be rewritten overnight, but culture? That took years. And people like her would have to keep showing up, keep speaking up even when it was exhausting. But for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. Because the sky didn't care what you looked like. It only cared if you knew how to fly. And now maybe the ground would start catching up. The grounding lasted 23 days. For Horizon Sky, it felt like a lifetime. For Ilara, it felt like the first real breath she'd taken in years. When the airline finally met all the FAA's conditions, verified training records for every pilot, new biometric crew verification at lounges and secure areas, mandatory anti-bias workshops co-developed with civil rights experts, and the hiring of an independent equity auditor approved by federal regulators, the FAA lifted the suspension. Flights resumed the next morning. Passengers returned, though some chose other carriers. Investors remained cautious, but the planes flew again. Ilara watched the first departure from a distance, standing near the perimeter fence at Atlanta's North Cargo ramp. She wasn't scheduled to fly that day. She'd been offered a spot on the inaugural post-grounding flight, a PR move she suspected, but she'd declined. She didn't want to be part of a photo op. She wanted real change, not a ribbon cutting. Back home that evening, her phone buzzed nonstop. News outlets wanted interviews. Podcasts asked her to be a guest. A documentary team reached out. She turned them all down. Not out of pride, but because she knew how these stories often went. One person lifted up as the face of a movement, then quietly set aside once the headlines faded. She didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted to be a pilot and maybe quietly a bridge for others. But one invitation she couldn't ignore came from a STEM aviation camp in Nashville. It was for girls aged 12 to 16, many from rural towns or underserved neighborhoods, most of them Black, Latina, or Indigenous. The camp director had written a long, heartfelt email. "They've seen your story. They need to hear it from you, not as a headline, but as a human." Ilara said yes. The camp was held in a hangar at a small municipal airport, the kind with grass runways and Cessnas tied down with bright orange ropes. Inside, the air smelled of oil, sawdust, and the faint sweetness of cotton candy from a nearby fair. Girls in flight-themed t-shirts huddled around simulators made from old computer parts and cardboard cockpits. Some were shy. Others asked rapid-fire questions about G-forces and crosswind landings. Ilara didn't give a speech. She sat on a folding chair in the middle of the group and just talked, about fixing engines with her grandfather, about failing her first solo landing, about the time she cried in a bathroom stall after an instructor told her she wasn't cut out for this. "I didn't have fancy connections," she said, picking at a loose thread on her flight bag. "I had grit, a library card, and a stubborn belief that the sky didn't belong to anyone but those willing to earn it." One girl, no older than 13, raised her hand. "Did you ever think about quitting?" Ilara didn't hesitate. "Every other week for the first 5 years." The girls laughed, but she could see the relief in their eyes. the unspoken fear that wanting something hard meant you were weak if you ever doubted yourself. She stayed late, helping them build paper airplanes, showing them how to read a sectional chart, letting them try on her old student pilot headset. Before she left, the camp director handed her a folded note from the group. Inside, in messy handwriting, it read, "You make us believe we can fly too." She tucked it into her logbook and didn't take it out for a week. Back in Atlanta, life slowly returned to something like normal. Horizon Sky's new policies were in place. The crew lounge now required biometric scans synced to the airline's crew manifest. No more subjective judgments. Security guards underwent retraining, and for the first time, the airline published an annual equity report, showing promotion rates, assignment patterns, and lounge access data broken down by race and gender. The guard who'd denied her entry was gone. The VP of Flight Operations, the one who'd signed off on the falsified training logs, had resigned. The CEO issued a new statement, this time naming specific changes and thanking those who spoke up. Even when it was hard. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Still, Ilara noticed the silence from some of her colleagues. A few pilots avoided eye contact in the briefing room. Others made vague comments like, "Things were fine before all this." She didn't engage. She knew resentment often followed accountability, especially when it came from someone who'd never had to fight for their seat. But not everyone stayed quiet. One afternoon, as she prepped for a flight to Denver, a first officer she barely knew, a white man in his 40s, approached her at the crew bus stop. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he said, shuffling his feet. "I was in that hallway the day it happened. I saw what that guard did, and I didn't say anything." Ilara looked at him. "Why not?" "Because I thought it wasn't my problem," he admitted. "But it is. And I won't stay quiet next time," she nodded. That's all anyone can ask. It wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. And sometimes that was enough to start rebuilding trust. Meanwhile, the FAA kept its foot on the pedal. Surprise audits became routine. Horizon Sky's compliance team now included 2 former pilots from underrepresented backgrounds, hired not for optics, but for their sharp eyes and sharper questions. And Ilara received a formal letter inviting her to join a new FAA advisory panel on equity in aviation safety. She almost said no. She didn't want to leave the cockpit for meetings and memos. But then she thought of the girls in Nashville, of Taylor, the flight attendant, of every pilot who'd been told they didn't look the part. She said yes. The panel's first task was to review national standards for crew verification across all U.S. airlines. Ilara pushed for clear, objective criteria, photo ID matched to digital manifests, standardized uniform guidelines that respected cultural and religious expression, and mandatory bystander intervention training for all ground personnel. It was slow work. Bureaucracy moved like a heavy jet taxiing in snow, but for the first time the conversation wasn't happening behind closed doors. It was happening with people who'd lived the problem at the table. One evening, after a long panel session, Ilara drove home under a sky streaked with sunset. She passed a billboard for a major airline. Its ad featured a diverse group of pilots, including a black woman in captain's stripes, standing confidently beside a gleaming jet. She smiled. Not because the ad was perfect, ads never were, but because it existed at all. Back in her kitchen, she poured a glass of water and checked her email. A message from Lena at the FAA. Horizon Sky just submitted their first quarterly equity report. Promotion rates for women of color are up 22%. Lounge access denials, 0 this quarter. Ilara read it twice. Then she walked out to her porch and sat in the quiet. She thought about the cost of speaking up, the sleepless nights, the sideways glances, the fear of being labeled the angry pilot. But she also thought about the cost of staying silent, the missed training, the unchecked bias, the slow erosion of safety and dignity. She hadn't set out to change an industry. She just wanted to walk into a room without having to prove she belonged. But sometimes, the smallest act of self-respect becomes the spark for something much bigger. And as the first stars appeared overhead, Ilara knew one thing for sure. The sky was still hers. And now maybe it was becoming theirs too. 3 months after the grounding, Horizon Sky wasn't just flying again. It was different. Not perfect, not overnight, but changed in ways that mattered. New crew verification kiosks stood at every secure entrance. scanning badges and matching faces to digital manifests in under 3 seconds. Training records were now updated in real time, with automatic alerts if a pilot simulator session lapsed. And for the first time, the airline's leadership team included voices that had once been ignored. Pilots and flight attendants from backgrounds long underrepresented in aviation leadership. Alara watched it all from the cockpit, where she belonged. She hadn't taken a desk job, hadn't traded her wings for a title. She still flew 4 days a week, still pre-flighted her aircraft with the same careful hands she'd used on her grandfather's old crop dusters. But now when she walked into the crew lounge, no one blinked. No one asked for extra ID. The space was just a space, quiet, functional hers, yet her role had quietly expanded. The FAA advisory panel met twice a month, and Alara brought real-world insight to every discussion. She pushed for changes that sounded small but meant everything, allowing natural hairstyles in official pilot photos, requiring anti-bias modules in recurrent training, creating anonymous reporting channels that actually led to action. She didn't speak often in meetings, but when she did, people listened. Still, her favorite moments weren't in boardrooms. They were in hangars, classrooms, and airport terminals, anywhere young people looked up at the sky and wondered if they could be part of it. One Saturday morning, she found herself at a community center in East Atlanta, standing in front of a group of teenagers building model drones from kits. Most had never been inside a real cockpit. One boy, no older than 15, asked her point blank, "Do they still treat you like you don't belong?" She didn't sugarcoat it. "Sometimes," she said. "But now I know I don't have to prove it. My license, my hours, my judgment, that's my proof. And no one gets to take that away." The room fell quiet. Then one girl raised her hand. "What if I'm scared I won't be good enough?" Alara smiled. "You won't be at first. None of us are. Flying isn't about being perfect. It's about being ready to learn, every single day." Afterward, the center's director handed her a thank you card signed by all the kids. Inside, one had written, "You made the sky feel closer." That stayed with her. Back at the airline, change kept rippling. Horizon Sky launched a mentorship program pairing junior pilots from underrepresented groups with experienced captains. Alara signed up immediately. Her first mentee was a young woman named Risha, a first officer with sharp eyes and steady hands, who'd grown up in a neighborhood where the only planes people saw were the ones flying overhead on approach to the airport. Risha was nervous during their first flight together. Not about the aircraft, she knew her systems cold, but about being seen. "What if someone questions me?" she asked during pre-flight. "Let them," Alara said, adjusting her headset, "then show them why they were wrong." They flew to Chicago that day, smooth and quiet. On the return leg, as they descended through scattered clouds, Risha handled the approach with calm precision. Alara watched her hands on the yoke, steady and sure, and felt a quiet pride, not because Risha was breaking barriers, but because she was simply doing her job, exactly as she'd been trained. That was the goal, after all. Not to make history, but to make history normal. Meanwhile, the industry took notice. Other airlines began adopting Horizon Sky's new verification protocols. The FAA rolled out a nationwide pilot program for equity audits, modeled partly on what had started in Atlanta. Even international carriers reached out, asking how to address similar issues in their own ranks. Alara never claimed credit. She knew real change wasn't built by one person. It was built by many, saying enough at the same time. One cool morning in early fall, she taxied out for a sunrise departure to Miami. Risha was in the right seat, now more confident, more herself. The tower cleared them for takeoff, and as the engines spooled up, Alara eased the throttles forward. The runway blurred beneath them, the city fading behind. "Rotate," she said. Risha pulled back gently, and the nose lifted. The wheels left the ground, and for a moment, there was only the hum of the engines and the quiet joy of flight. "You've got this," Alara said, her voice calm, certain. Risha nodded, eyes fixed ahead. "I know. Up here, none of it mattered. The color of their skin, the texture of their hair, the doubts they'd carried on the ground. Up here, there was only skill, trust, and the endless blue." Later, over coffee in the crew hotel, Risha asked, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up that day?" Alara stirred her cup slowly. I think about what would have happened if I had stayed quiet. Maybe nothing, or maybe something worse, a missed emergency, a delayed response, a crash no one saw coming because we were too busy pretending everything was fine. She looked out the window at the palm trees swaying in the breeze. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for what you've already earned. As the weeks passed, Elara noticed something new. She wasn't the only one anymore. At crew briefings, she saw more faces that looked like hers. Black women in captain stripes, South Asian first officers, indigenous flight engineers. Not many, not yet, but enough to shift the air in the room. Enough to make a young pilot walking in for the first time feel like she wasn't alone. One evening, while waiting for a delayed departure, she ran into Taylor, the flight attendant who'd shown up on her porch months ago. "T,